So Dante, you are an active career foreign part of our foreign policy apparatus, foreign service officer, calling us from overseas. This is the embassy is a recounting of I guess the resolution of, is that fair to say, of a civil war.
Yes. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on, Sam. It's a privilege and an honor to be able to talk to you. I really appreciate your show. And I'm calling in from Hong Kong. I just wanted to say that the book really tells the story of the climax of the Liberian Civil War and focuses a lot on the role of peacemakers, and in particular, a strong focus on what an embassy does and what an ambassador does in a time of war, and the smart risks that people have to take to be able to bring conflict to a conclusion. We hear a lot about war makers and going to war, and in some senses that's the easy part. It's much harder to bring wars to a conclusion, as we've seen in other parts of the world.
I think there's a lot of, and I want to get to the specifics of this story because I don't think people know too much about Liberia. And in fact, let's start with that. I mean, tell us about some of the specifics of this, because I'm not convinced that people are, A, have very much awareness about Liberia, or B, that U.S. Foreign Service plays this kind of role in many places around the world. It just doesn't get the attention.
Sure. Let me start with a little bit of a quick, down and dirty overview of the relationship that we have with Liberia as a country. A lot of people don't know the history, as you rightly point out. The United States actually helped found Liberia back in the 1820s. The idea behind it was actually to send freed American slaves back to Africa and see if they could start a state. When the Americans got to the continent, there were actually people living there. And they formed a state that became Liberia, but it had these inherent tensions between what became known as the Americo-Liberians and the local population. And that tension played out over many, many years. And then in 1980, there was a coup, and Samuel Doe came to power, and it started a cycle of civil war and coups that really lasted into the 90s, when Charles Taylor became a dominant, notorious warlord. And he wasn't able to grab state power, but he had a period of factional fighting that just destroyed the country, just completely destroyed the country. And for a long time, the United States had supported Samuel Doe in the 80s because Liberia was a great ally of ours from World War II all the way into the Cold War. Liberia produced rubber and things like that, and a lot of natural resources for us all the way in the 40s, 50s, 60s. And so we had a big, big military presence. We had a big security presence there. But in the 80s, they really played the Cold War game. And then in the 90s, as the Cold War came to an end, the human rights record was atrocious. And we basically pulled up our stakes right at the time that the state was completely collapsing. And so Charles Taylor was this feared warlord, but he couldn't quite gain power in the state. But he eventually won the presidency in a sort of mediated situation. So then fast forward to 2003, the period that my book covers, and Charles Taylor is still in power as the elected president, but he had never really dropped his warlord ways. And so the state was very predatory on much of the population. And you also had a massive amount of displaced or refugees. So of a country of less than 3 million, you had more than 1.5 million people were living in displaced camps or out of the country in refugee camps. And into this combustible mix, 2 rebel armies attacked to try to overthrow Charles Taylor. So it was a a mounting bloodbath as these rebel armies marched on the capital. And Charles Taylor had resisted for many years, had resisted going to the peace table. But he could see the writing on the wall. He was losing power. We had put some sanctions on him. You've heard about blood diamonds. You've heard about conflict timber. These were the things that they were selling to get cash to fund the war. And he finally went to a peace conference. And right at the opening of the peace conference, an international court, which was prosecuting, trying to get Taylor for crimes committed in Sierra Leone, the neighboring state, they unsealed an indictment. And so the court was hoping that they would render Taylor on the spot to Sierra Leone, and instead he flew back to Liberia. And then the rebels attacked the capital, and it was just a complete 3 months of high drama with civilians getting killed left and right, and a really, really difficult time for the Liberian people. So that's sort of the context and the backdrop that the diplomacy that we talk about in the book comes to the fore.
And I mean, I think what's stunning to me is that, I mean, is it accurate to say that that conflict that takes place, over 100 years after the founding of the country is a function of that original dynamic in bringing in freed slaves from America and people who and then indigenous populations, that those fissures never were properly resolved?
Yeah, they were never resolved, and they played into the Samuel Doe coup. Samuel Doe in 1980, he was the first indigenous leader of the country, and then it started a wave of sort of ethnic going after different ethnic groups and battles. And then by the time Charles Taylor came in, he had a mixture of Americo-Liberians and indigenous folks that he worked with, but the country had basically been completely destroyed and ravaged at that point. So really no economy left other than this cash and carry economy that they had going. So no, those tensions were never resolved, and even to this day, they've been suppressed, but those dynamics still play out in the society, as all societies work through these long-standing historical issues.
All right, when we come back, I want to take a break, but when we come back, I want to ask you, one, if America was uniquely situated to help in Liberia, and where else America actually is situated to do those type of things. But then I want to broadly talk about the idea of foreign policy and the idea of interventionism, how it's been practiced in the past in this country, to get a broad sense of where we might be going with a new administration coming in, and making picks that are in many ways controversial, amongst others, but particularly in the Foreign Service. We got to take a quick break. We'll be right back with Dante Paradiso.
Great. Look forward to it.